Welcome to the Digital Velocity Podcast, a podcast covering the intersection between strategy, digital marketing, and emerging trends impacting each of us. In each episode, we interview industry veterans to dive into the best, hard-hitting analysis of industry news and critical topics facing brand executives. Now, here are your hosts, Tim Curtis and Eric Martinez.
Hi, I'm Eric Martinez from Blue Tangerine, and I'm super excited to introduce the Digital Velocity Podcast, where you will learn a lot about digital marketing and probably a lot of other things along the way. I'm here today to introduce my co-host, Tim Curtis, President of CohereOne. Tim is a longtime friend and former client. We worked on a couple of projects together, and we decided to give this a shot. So I'd like to take a little bit of time today and learn about Tim. Tim, welcome to Digital Velocity.
Thanks, Eric. It's good to be here.
So Tim, tell us a little bit about your path in digital marketing.
So my path in digital marketing actually started, I would call it a little unintentionally. My initial path into marketing was through database. And it was actually taking deep dives into large data sets, helping to kind of develop audiences for global marketing campaigns in Europe and in the United States. As a result of that, I started getting into email and early pay-per-click. That was kind of an initial outgrowth as we were in the, I'd call it the Wild West stages of early web development and e-commerce. That was really where I got started and just fell in love with it. So everything I did from that period on was really all about connecting all of the different pieces of what I would consider to be a strong e-commerce ecosystem and connecting that with the larger ecosystem of a business, and just had so much fun doing it.
Interesting. So tell me a little bit about how your path to CohereOne and what CohereOne does and how that ties into digital marketing today.
Yeah. So again, a little bit of a journey, a little bit of a story. Initially, when I started out, I went to my undergrad in marketing and started in international business and marketing specifically. So I was running country operations throughout Europe and in the United States and Canada, and of course also in Australia. But my path kind of continued to evolve, and I was working both from a data perspective as well as a digital marketing perspective. And those two paths kind of converged. And I started kind of weaving in between time on the client side and time on the agency side. Fast forward to a few years ago, and I was doing digital marketing consulting for large enterprises and got a call from a good friend of mine who said, "Now, don't say no." That was initially how the conversation started. He said, "We need to tap somebody to be the next executive for this agency and consulting firm. And we think you have the right qualities to do it." So a little bit about that. CohereOne is a firm that got started in the early 90s under a different name, but it's kind of evolved over the years. The focus of what we historically worked on was data, strategic data, and databases, et cetera. And really the largest expression of that was for direct mail campaigns, catalogs, et cetera. Over the years, as those have continued to be large focuses for the brand, now we're working with a lot of clients on helping to engage their larger ecosystem. So for example, we're taking a lot of their digital marketing and the digital indicators and cues and feeding that into their offline marketing campaigns. So we're really optimizing top of funnel and bottom of funnel for clients. We also have strategic engagements where we act either directing all the strategy, or we're also in roles of directing strategy, plus we're the de facto CMO for the brand. That journey actually kind of culminated just in a good friend, a connection, and saying, "Hey, we think you're the right fit for this." So that's how we ended up at CohereOne. That really is the business of what we do today.
So Tim, that's obviously a lot about your work background. Tell me a little bit about something that nobody else knows.
One thing that most people are surprised to know is that I turned down very significant scholarship opportunities for vocal performance. And I did that instead to focus on studying marketing international business. My goal had never really been to be a singer and to have the stage and the lights and et cetera. But I did come to a point where I had to make a conscious decision that that really wasn't what I was going to do. But I have found that all of that training and all of that background has certainly helped me from a business perspective because I do a lot of public speaking. So that vocal performance really was a solid foundation upon which I could build a speaking career. So that's kind of one of those little things that most people don't know about. Every once in a while, I'll go out and do some singing.
So does that mean
pretty
you
busy
can
these
sing the
days.
Star Spangled Banner for us right now?
I would not, but do thank you for asking, though.
Oh man, what a hater. All right,
What a hater.
we'll move on. So let's dig in a little bit and talk about your career in general. We've all had these interesting challenges through our careers that brought us to the place that we're at. Can you tell us a little bit about one thing that you wish you had known when you started your career?
Yeah, I don't know if there's one thing. There's a couple things that generally I've kind of bookmarked for myself, if you will, just something that I remind myself when I think about career and as I've done speaking engagements. A couple of valuable lessons. Anybody in their career, they're going to have setbacks. I think there were times when setbacks, maybe company performance, etc. And I've come to realize that those are really what I would call plot twists, nothing more. So I tend to not get so upset about setbacks. I tend to look at them a little bit more objectively. Second thing is a quote I've heard several times, and I really have kind of made it my own. Mistakes are tuition. Learn from every one you make. Those are really, really valuable lessons to me. The last ones I would say is things I wish I had known is be curious. Sometimes I think people get a little frustrated when, why is he always asking questions? But if you don't lose that inquisitive nature about yourself, you'll go further in life and you'll go further in your career. And lastly, don't be afraid to ask the questions, but then listen. Don't always speak. I think that was a key learning for me from an early age.
We both run agencies of our own, and listening is an important skill, right?
Mm-hmm.
Listening to our clients talk about their issues and their challenges and their successes, right? We sometimes focus overly on the negative and not the positive. So that's where some of that innate curiosity comes in. Tell us a story about a time where a client of yours came to you with a particular challenge and you had to dig in and find a solution.
So just a few years ago, we had a client that had some very, very significant business challenges. They would classify their market as being highly disrupted. I would counter that. I think it's very difficult in today's world to find businesses that aren't in a very highly disruptive vertical. But in this case, they really felt like they were facing some major decisions. They engaged us to get a better sense of what was happening with their customer base and essentially have a better understanding of if I had $1 to spend, where would I spend it? So long story short, we spent a lot of time testing and validating a lot of assumptions with the client to determine what the right level of investment was and where that investment needed to go. Unfortunately, at the end of the engagement or the end of the study, the client said, very insightful, but the CEO himself said, but I think I have intuition on this, and this is the direction we need to go. We actually laid out his vision and laid it against the set of data and understood the impact of that, provided some revised, what I would call pro formas or forecast on what could happen potentially if those changes were made. Unfortunately, in this case, the client did plow right ahead. And within about 8 months, the resulting changes had a cascading effect, which ended in bankruptcy and dissolvement. So unfortunately, it's not a happy story, but it's a story with a lesson that I think is important, that sometimes the consequences are so grave that we really have to balance and be aware of our intentional bias that we all carry with us. It's hard to fight against that. When you're working with clients, you don't always know when you're engaging where or what that bias is, but you will uncover it. I think it's incumbent on those of us who now reside in an advisement capacity that we have to not only lay out, here's a plan, but also lay out what's at stake. So that would be what I would say as a story of the potential effects of client engagement and the unfortunate side effects of when decisions are made that maybe aren't best for the long term.
Let's dig into that. Over the years, you and I have talked about this concept of leading with bias, right? I know when I talk to clients, we are all making assumptions all the time. I remember one of my first bosses way back in the day said, you never make assumptions, they're evil. I kind of countered with, but you got to make assumptions and then you got to validate them, You got to validate the truth. I find that in our busy lives today, that more and more marketers don't necessarily take the time to validate their assumptions and that the underpinnings of their plans are actually working the way that they are. Can you shed some more light on that? I know you're in discussions with CEOs all the time. What do those conversations sound like?
So what do those conversations sound like? There are some consistencies in the conversation. Obviously, the voices are often quite different or quite disparate, but where I would say there's some consistency is in laying out what I would call some, not warnings, but just some general knowledge when we're tackling assumptions. We begin to see a bias beginning to creep into maybe a conversation, or there's some strategic plans that have been laid out that clearly have an element of bias. One of the things that I like to talk about specifically is something called Angel's Cocktail. It's probably something that people aren't necessarily aware of. It's an area of neuroscience or psychology. The Angel's Cocktail specifically is a combination of dopamines, oxytocins, and endorphins. And when those flood your system and you're super passionate about something, it could be in those early stages of falling in love. Well, the closer you are, the more over the top passionate about these things, then chemically, the less objective you are able to be. So oftentimes these companies and these executives have found themselves unintentionally, neurologically and psychologically walking into a predicament where they are setting themselves up for failure because they didn't realize that the longer and more that they have built this momentum towards a goal that they wanted, the less objectively open they've been to examine those motives and understand that chemically they're not really at a place to do that. So when we talk about that with clients, it's important to understand the ramifications. These are very, very important issues that if we don't get right and we don't lay these out and have an honest conversation, then we're not putting our best work forward, and the client is not going to have the best opportunity for success. So sometimes I think people envision these conversations with executives being around maybe a particular channel, and sometimes that's true, but I found that we have to typically have a larger conversation. Sometimes that also includes merchandise and maybe the effectiveness or lack thereof of their merchandising mix. So all in all, pretty important conversations, but you really have to lay that groundwork if you really want to be successful.
So when you run into a CEO or a VP that has some of these preconceived biases, how do you attack that? I'm like, hey, man, we can't go down to the cocktail lounge and drink some of this Kool-Aid. What evidence do you provide to help persuade them move in a different direction?
Well, you have those conversations, just like the Angel's Cocktail. You talk about what you're observing. If you find, and you do find this at times, that the individual across from the table is not willing or is unable to make the necessary adjustments, then it really becomes a decision on your part. Are you going to roll forward with the client or an engagement if the very framework is not setting itself up for success? Now, a lot of times agencies will do whatever they can to grab an engagement, but I like to think that we're a little bit more objective about that. And we look, is the client going to be successful? If the client's not, and they're really wanting to do a particular strategy that we see from a data perspective, that it's not positioned well for success, then I say it really then becomes a decision on our part on whether or not we're going to go forward with that engagement. I think it's perfectly fine to say, hey, you know what? That's not what we see, and we're not comfortable going that direction. Perhaps there's someone that maybe is better aligned for your particular goals.
So that conversation's got to feel pretty intense. I guess the thing that raises some concern or alarm bells in my head is, what data are we using too? In digital marketing, many of us use Google Analytics as our source of truth. We know it's imperfect. Digital tracking, while have gotten better, is still very suspect from time to time. How do you reconcile the fact that sometimes the data that we're working with relative to the assumptions that your clients are making are shaping some of the decisions that we're making as marketers?
You know well enough that when we handle an engagement, we're not looking for Google Analytics to necessarily tell us the truth because it is largely directional. We will take a large export of raw data and then begin to work from that. We try to strip out the channel activity out of that, at least initially, in order to get a sense of what's happening, how many buyers are in this customer's database or in this 12-month database. Is that number shrinking? Is that number growing? If we're seeing, for example, merchandise purchasing habits that are declining rapidly in what we call the hotline segment, which is a 0 to 3 month or 0 to 6 month hotlines, who are typically the best buyers, then we know there's some larger conversations that need to be had. It then turns to deeper dive. Maybe it's a lifetime value study. It could be looking at particular channel activity, what's happening within the email program, et cetera. So we go back to a Google Analytics, for an example, or the web analytics platform of choice, and then we'll begin to look at what we have from a data perspective and how does that line up with the story we're seeing coming out of the web analytics. That's where you start to piece things together and it becomes a puzzle, and slowly but surely a mosaic begins to emerge. It's not something that you can push a button and get. And I think one of the things that we've got to remember with digital marketing is that a lot of digital marketing happens in a black box. We don't have visibility to a lot of the algorithms, et cetera, that are running. And that's a question for digital marketers. Those are things that we have to constantly question and ask, is our best interest at hand within these algorithms? We do try to look at other pieces of information, primarily the transactional file, to look at what transactions are occurring, where they're occurring, how they're occurring, then through what channels they're occurring, and start to build a pattern of the interactivity between all those channels.
Interesting. Well, we kind of diverged from Tim Curtis and then to some bigger issues. So I'm going to draw us back to Tim Curtis for a moment. Tell us a little bit about the types of tools and resources that you're using to stay on top of this game. We were just talking about analytics, and that is just one piece of a very complicated puzzle that is digital marketing today. What are you looking at? What are you listening to? What are you reading?
Yeah. You said something there that spurred a thought in my head. I mentioned earlier about the two stages. The analytics, of course, what's happening in the data and understanding that is key. I think the more important element really is not necessarily just the analytics, but it's the conversation and the thinking around what's at stake, which demonstrates a higher level of strategic thinking, really getting outside of the normal paradigms of thinking of channel activity or potential channel shift between two channels. So at this risk of sounding just a bit disingenuous here, I really do tend to focus on a couple things. The first one is podcast. There are a few podcasts that I routinely listen to because they help me think from new perspectives. I always kind of thought of them myself as master classes that I get to sit in on for free. I can't begin to tell you how many ideas were germinated or concepts developed from listening to those podcasts. For me, they're really, really important to keep my vision focused. And that's what helps me to kind of think, all right, maybe I'm not thinking at this from the right perspective. Then I kind of go about it thinking from another angle.
So what's your favorite podcast to listen to?
You know well enough to know that I don't have one particular favorite, but I'll give you three. I'll give you 3 or 4, I guess, that I routinely listen to. The first is Consulting Success Podcast by Michael Zabersky. Michael brings on a lot of consultants like myself who talk about their journey, but also what's unique about their perspective. I really enjoy hearing their work and what's happening with them and how they think about problems. 2 other ones actually come more from the academic side, one of which is the HBR IdeaCast from Harvard Business Review. I'm a subscriber to Harvard Business Review, and I find the content and the interviews very, very enlightening and really, again, makes you really think about issues. The other is Knowledge at Wharton, and that is from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. The topics are really sometimes all over the board. One of my favorites was one actually about antiquity, Roman antiquities. It was the great minds of Rome, Caesar, Cicero, etc. Just fascinating stuff. And then one of the last ones that I like to listen to is actually with Malcolm Gladwell. It's called Revisionist History. It's really rethinking history from a different perspective. Again, it's all about thinking, positioning yourself to think. The other exercise, kind of see if I can explain this here, involves a bit more of imagination. So a couple years ago, Michael Watkins published a book with HBR Press, and I've got it right here in front of me. It's called The First 90 Days. Yep, that's it. But it easily ranks as one of the most influential books to my career and my career development. It's about essentially how to onboard in the first 90 days of a new job to ensure you're up to speed faster, you're transitioning as best as humanly possible, yada, yada, yada. But I've adapted it for further use. So at least twice a year, I go in and I approach my executive role or a role with a client as if it's my first day today. Now, it takes a lot of mental focus because you really have to re-examine the mundane and the status quo. You got to ask yourself, is this the most efficient way of doing this? You begin to see the organization with fresh eyes. You identify, new areas of growth, places maybe that need to be cut back or optimized.
Tim, give me an example of that today that you're experiencing that's kind of mundane and needs to be transformed within your organization.
So one of the things that came to mind one of the last times I did this little exercise was I was taking a look at the story we were telling with the data and how that story was being told, what dashboards, what visuals, etc. I put myself in the perspective, this is the first time I'm coming in. These numbers don't make any sense to me. I don't have that context. Then all of a sudden, I was able to view it differently. I was able to view it as an executive who maybe doesn't have the same degree of data literacy that I have. What I found was in examining that the way that we were presenting that data at the time, some of those key salient points might not have been best communicated. So it was really going back to examine what this piece of information here would have been better represented in something visual than it would have in terms of some type of number on whether it's on a presentation or a PowerPoint or something like that. So that's an example. But if I had just done the mundane, I would look at those numbers and I wouldn't necessarily have gone through that mental exercise of taking all the context and stripping it away to understand, maybe this isn't the best way to present this information.
Sounds like every day in my house with my wife.
Well, there you go.
So, Tim, who do you think are the most influential people in your career? Who's helped you shape where you are today?
Well, the first one's easy. It would be my dad. Unfortunately, we lost him earlier this year. He's somebody who played a hugely influential role in my life, from the importance of character development and integrity to a love of all things history. He read just about every biography, historical account, spiritual memoir, whatever he could get his hands on. It didn't matter. Some of these things were like phone books. That devotion to lifelong learning made him an incredibly well-rounded individual. The full impact that he's had on his fellow man throughout his life, we'll never know. But yeah, I miss him. He was a giant of a man, but his influence in those areas are things that I'll continue to carry with me the rest of my life, and I'll pass on to my kids. Let's see. Another one that I would say is someone that has influenced me. Of course, some of these I obviously have not met, but would be Winston Churchill. I have not met Winston Churchill. Yeah, that would involve a time machine, unfortunately. Winston Churchill's life is obviously, extremely interesting, but I really found his leadership, his writing, his speeches, especially as he was prime minister during World War II, that period of time when Great Britain stood alone versus the Axis. He literally had the weight of the world on his shoulders. Even when he faced sort of abandonment, even within his own cabinet, the courage of his convictions held him strong. He did not flinch, staring Hitler in the eye. Of course, obviously the rest is, as we say, history, but there's some incredible leadership lessons there. If you start to read the stories about what all was happening, you begin to recognize that he literally at times, he was holding together the entire British government in order to get through those dark days of the Blitz. When they came out of that, they had a fighting spirit that nobody in Germany in particular could match. So it really became a distinct advantage. I've always felt as if he's got some great history lessons that we could all learn from in leadership. The last one I would say is kind of a twofer.
Doesn't that mean there's four, Tim? You said three. And now this is
A and B,
four.
maybe I only am following half of what they do, right? So half plus half equals one. Yeah, so we're getting into math. No, it would be Steve Jobs and Johnny Ive. Steve Jobs probably a bit controversial to say that, but I'm purely talking about the business context, not Steve Jobs, the man. What I learned from watching Steve Jobs and the ascendancy of Apple really was how, number one, he had an unwavering commitment of simplicity married to design, period. There are so many well-known stories of Steve Jobs entering a room full of engineers who'd spent the better part of a year or two developing a product, only for Steve Jobs to walk in the room, draw a very simple diagram on the front of the whiteboard or whatever, and then basically have them adapt their plans and renderings to that level of user experience and walk out of the room. He was unwavering in his determination that he was not going to be influenced by the quote unquote tech crowd that then began to complicate his devices and make them harder to use. When you look back on that, you begin to see that singular focus is really what helped Apple develop into what Apple is today. The other side of that is Johnny Ive. For those of you who don't know, Johnny Ive was the longtime designer responsible for the creative direction of Apple. Johnny did a great interview with the New Yorker back in 2015, where he really stressed the importance, and he quote, "Consumers can feel when something is designed carefully, even if they can't articulate it." So I feel like, and I tell clients this often, we live in a time where design and then intentionality and form and function are supreme strategic advantages. It doesn't matter if you're talking about technology or if you're talking about apparel. I mean, if you look at apparel and just the different types of fabric, the different types of fit, we're living in a period where the level of intentionality has never been higher. I feel like Johnny Ive taught me that you've got to be relentless in the pursuit of that right design aesthetic, that right form and function, particularly when you're dealing with anything that's consumer facing. People are very, very particular.
Yeah, Tim, that is a really, really good point. Everyone listening should apply that to your websites. We have many, 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 many examples, some that we've created ourselves, that were just sitting there and going, I can't believe I created that monstrosity, because it is way too complicated for anybody to understand.
Yep. Well, and you think about that now, and you think about when, for example, we're seeing clients they're now spending more money on these very highly emotive, very highly driving print campaigns that are merchandising the products in incredible ways. And it's driving a high degree of qualified traffic to the website. And that website is either A, not optimized for that traffic, B, is not really contextualized and personalized for the audience that's coming, or C, just flat out stinks and is not set up for that level of design. And right away, you're losing all of that engagement.
Pop quiz.
Yeah.
Your favorite website?
Oh, man. My favorite website.
Time to move on.
Apple.
It's so simple. I knew you were going to say that. By the way, yeah. Tim wears Apple shirts all day long.
I do not wear Apple shirts all the time.
He has Apple branding on his forehead. No.
Although I will say I have now officially switched to pretty much everything in the Apple ecosystem. It just works better for my life.
We have this debate frequently. Okay. Least favorite website. Go.
Least favorite website. Probably Drudge Report. I probably haven't been there in 6 months, but it's hard for me to make sense of it all. There's just so many headlines and so many colors. It is what it is.
Favorite color?
My favorite color? Black. You knew I was going to answer that.
I knew you were going to answer that. Some might say that's my favorite color as well. So Tim, what do you like to do outside of work? I think I know the answer to this.
For a long time, I was a USTA tennis player. So tennis would have been my answer. I had an injury a couple of years ago that slowed me down a little bit. So now I really spend my time doing three things. Love to cook. Actually have a huge passion for cooking.
What's your favorite thing to cook?
Favorite thing to cook? It's probably either bulgogi, which is a Korean barbecue dish, or something Italian. Those are probably the two that I would probably say are my two favorite cuisine types to cook. Beyond that, I would say I work out a couple times a week with a personal trainer. I really, really like that. That's something that kind of helps me, reset and push towards a goal, which is good. And the last thing is something that a couple of years ago I started, which was ancestry. Had a question, something came up about genealogy and I didn't have an answer for it. So I remember asking my parents, hey, do you know anything about that? I realized that we didn't really know anything beyond just what anecdotally had been told to us. So I kind of set out on a journey about 6 years ago, fast forward, and now I've got all sorts of information that goes back roughly 1,000 years. I've made a lot of interesting discoveries. And it's one of those things that when you get into it, it just sucks you in. It's sort of a little bit of a mystery, but it's fun to do.
So, are you a peasant or were you related to a Scottish or Viking lord?
Yes, I was, as a matter of fact.
Tim, one last question for the audience. If you could do anything in the world with no limits on cost or whatever, what would that one thing be?
So I would move to Europe and study languages, period.
Really?
Yeah, I would start in Barcelona because I have a deep love of Spanish culture and language. That was one of my majors in college and in international business. And I would make my way around to France, Italy, Portugal, and Romania. And I would get the 5 Romance languages that stem from Latin. That's easily the one thing I would do. Languages have sort of come easy to me. I actually did some study as well with Korean.
Well, Tim, we want to be respectful of your time and just have a couple more questions before we wrap this up. Tell me, in what we do every day, there's a lot of complexity and myths about what we do and the voodoo behind the scenes. What is one common myth about our profession that you would want to debunk?
So, good question. There's probably a couple. The first one I would say maybe is a little bit more specific to CohereOne. And as you know, we focus very, very heavily on data, advanced audience development. A lot of times that does end up in the offline channels, catalog, direct mail, et cetera. I think sometimes when you start talking about data and real intense usages of data, there tends to be a mindset that, okay, that's for either a database or that's specifically going to feed into a catalog or a direct mail campaign. You don't realize that great strategic data and a schema that really takes advantage of all of the segmentation possibilities, all of the digital indicators, all of that is a springboard that can be used to supercharge. It's sort of rocket fuel, not only for your offline campaigns, but for your online campaigns. You can set up entire new email streams. You can break existing email streams into more highly contextualized streams, drip nurture campaigns, et cetera. You can do things with custom audiences and display that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. You can use much more lucrative streams to really get hyper personalized on your landing pages and on your site transforms. Don't think of data as just something that is in the back room with that visor on. It really is something that is then used as that proverbial rocket fuel to supercharge your business. I wish people wouldn't think of it that way.
All right. Well, Tim, if you had to leave our listeners with one thought today, what would it be?
One thought today, probably, are you aware of your own intentional bias? Are you aware of where it pops its head in? Or are you so passionate about certain areas that you could freely admit to yourself that, you know what, perhaps I am not in a position to be as objectively observant as I could be? If you can be real and honest with yourself there, and you have others that you can confide in and say, is this a vulnerability for me? You'll unlock opportunities for yourself in ways that you can't imagine. But as long as you continue to not necessarily be aware of those areas of growth or those opportunities for growth, you're limiting yourself. You're limiting your overall effectiveness and you're limiting your career effectiveness. So if you can tackle those, then I think that's really where you'll begin to unlock potential for yourself, for your client, or for your company for the long term.
Awesome, Tim. Well, if our listeners wanted to connect with you, what's the best way?
Easiest way to connect with me, of course, is to find me on LinkedIn. Fun fact, I don't respond to sales inquiries on LinkedIn because I just simply get too many of them. But if you mention you heard me on the Digital Velocity podcast, that'll help you get through the filters. You can also reach out to me via my speaker site, which is timcurtisdcmp.com. I do a lot of keynotes, and so typically that's where I do field those requests.
I honestly have to ask one more question.
Yeah.
DCMP. What does that even stand
So
for?
DCMP, that is a certification I hold. It is a certified direct marketing professional, data marketing professional. And that's a certification I've held for 8-9 years, something like that.
Okay. Well, Tim, thank you very much for your time. That wraps up this episode of the Digital Velocity Podcast. Tim and I are super excited to explore with you the world of digital marketing and issues that surround our industry. I'm Eric Martinez from Blue Tangerine.
And I'm Tim Curtis, CEO of CohereOne.
Thank you for listening. To learn more about how Blue Tangerine and CohereOne can help you generate more sales for your business, visit bluetangerine.com and cohereone.com. If you have enjoyed our show today, please tell a friend, leave us a review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Visit the digitalvelocitypodcast.com website to send us your questions and topic suggestions. Be sure to join us again on the Digital Velocity Podcast.